Hey, this is Sanyam Bhutani, and you're listening to Chai Time Data Science, a podcast for data science enthusiasts where I interview practitioners, researchers, and Kagglers about their journey, experience, and talk all things about data science. Welcome to Chai and Python, ctds.show. In this episode, I interview Michael Kennedy, the host of Talk Python podcast and Python Bytes podcast, which in my opinion and in the opinion of programmers is one of the best Python podcasts to know about Python in general, or the Python Bytes podcast, which brings you regular updates about what's happening in the community. So if you haven't heard about these, please be sure to check them out. You should be able to look them up or find the links in the show notes. Talk Python also has a great library of courses and content. Would highly recommend checking them out as well. I have been a student of these courses and I've really enjoyed these. As you expect in this episode, I talk about Michael's journey. I talk Python to him and learn how did he get started in programming and Python. Michael has been hosting the podcast for 5 years and has been in the programming world for even longer. We dive into what he's learned through this and his perspective, how it has evolved through creating content and through creating these courses and eventually a business around it as well. I feel that as machine learning practitioners or as data scientists, all of us also need to learn a lot more about the ecosystem, the Python ecosystem in general, and that's a highly underrated skill. So I hope this episode inspires you and you take away some great insights from there as I did. Without further ado, here's my interview with Michael Kennedy. Please enjoy the show. I am honored to be talking Python on the show with Michael Kennedy. Michael, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, it's really great to be here with you. It's an honor to be on the show, and I love talking Python.
Like I was telling you off the call as well. I'm really honored because I got more interest in Python because of your show. So I'm excited to be talking about your journey. I want to start by asking you the question that you begin your interviews with. How did you get interested in Python and when did you discover it? I read that you were working on some low-level programming stuff before that.
Yeah, I'd done a lot of work in C#. I started out doing C++ on Silicon Graphics, like mainframe, almost supercomputer type things, and doing OpenGL and like scientific programming. I actually was studying math. I wasn't studying computer science, but in order to do my math research, I had to learn a little bit of programming. And I'm like, this is way better than doing the math. So this is awesome. Like, I didn't know I could do this. We're doing more of this, right? More programming, please. So I went through a whole journey. I spent a lot of time in the C-based languages, C, C++, C#, even some JavaScript in there. And they all kind of felt pretty similar and the same. And Python was really different to me. So for better or worse, I came to Python somewhat later in my career. I had been in programming for a while. And I just, I had been living in the C# world for a while. And I realized I don't want to be stuck in this sort of one company controls the whole tech stack that I care about space. Let me go learn something else. And I looked around and said, well, what else is there? What's popular? What seems to be cool? I actually had a couple of friends who I met who I really respected their programming skills. But I met them in a sort of technology agnostic space. So, well, what kind of programming do you like? What language do you use? They said, I use Python. Okay, that's kind of cool. I didn't really think about that. Next guy I talked to, oh yeah, man, we do all our stuff in Python. It's so, I mean, everyone here that seems to be really like smart and knowledgeable is all doing Python. Like, what am I missing? So I looked into it and I'm like, I wish I found this sooner. Right? I really, really love it. I love the clarity of the language. But I also love the fact that there's, 220,000 different libraries just at your fingertips. You can just ask, install some magical thing There's there's that fantastic XKCD cartoon comic. Have you seen it about pip install anti-gravity? Oh yeah.
I have.
In fact, all you got to do in Python, did you know if you did this, if you open up Python, the Python REPL, at least Python 3, and you type import anti-gravity, it will open up that comic
I didn't know that.
in the real Python. Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful.
And I think this has been a recurring theme on your podcast as well. People always mention that I wish I had discovered Python earlier than I found it.
Yeah. Yeah. And for some people, this is, I wish I realized I could solve my problems with programming sooner. A lot of those people happen to be in the data science side of things as well, right? I think data science has more diversity in terms of like people's backgrounds, right? Like if you come in and you're going to go build web apps, or you're going to come in and you're going to build those kinds of computer science type things, you come from a certain background a lot of times. But the people who come into to the data science world, they're pulled in from all these other interests. Like maybe I was a biologist, or I was a race car simulator, or I was a philosopher. But any of those folks need to do a little bit of programming. A lot of times they choose Python, and then they love it and they stay. So there's just people coming from so many different places. And often what I hear from them is, this really changed the way that I could work and the way that I could do things. I didn't really think of myself as a programmer, and yet here I'm building something awesome, that I'm sharing with the world.
Yeah. And do you agree that people, at least data scientists, not in the senior roles, if they start looking outside of the data science stack as well, there's a lot to discover, because you also need to be able to create a UI around it. When you're working on a MVP, you should be able to build other stuff as well. And people, again, feel that they should have discovered those side of Python as well earlier. Yeah,
that's a really interesting, especially on the data science side, because the comparison is, well, maybe I could do R or Julia, or I could do MATLAB or one of these other languages. But what's special about Python is you can go and build all the other computer science-y application type stuff, right? You don't have to completely switch languages. Like, well, I want a website, so now I got to go learn Node and JavaScript, or you just keep going with Python.
And I think we'll get into this in a bit, but you also run the famous Python Bytes podcast. Does it still fascinate you to the extent that you keep discovering new libraries, or are you not surprised anymore by the things you keep discovering there?
Well, you kind of get used to the surprise, right? Like I've always, so people who don't know, the Python Bytes podcast is like a audio newsletter with analysis, right? It's like we cover six or more things every week, and we just give a few minutes thoughts on each of it. So we're always discovering things. And at first that meant me just doing tons of research. Like I was all over the Reddit, Python subreddit, or I was on Hacker News or Twitter, and just, digging into these places. And now I don't even do that anymore. All I do is I just answer email, because people are like, oh, that was amazing. Here's 5 other things like it that are also amazing that you maybe didn't know about, right? So just, there's so many people that are sending me these new ideas. It's all new. I mean, not all of it. Most of it is new to me. I'm like, I had no idea this thing existed. Thank you for sharing it with me. It's amazing. And it's really cool that you get to spend a little bit of time each week to just stay on top of what's useful and new and what's out there, right? I think it really helps you as a programmer be more effective, because you're like, oh, I never used that thing, but I know about it. I'll just go look it up again, and that's going to solve my problem. And you basically learn that as doing the podcast. It's great.
Do you think creating content, if I may call it creating content, has also helped you as a programmer in any extent? Has it allowed you to change your perspective after meeting so many people, or also in general exploring all of these frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you an example. If I worked at like a big company, and my job was to work on the data exchange between, say, like a stock trading engine and the front end that the traders use on their, I could understand that really, really well, right? I would know all about like the data exchange and what we tried and how the networks work. But you might not ever learn about, Django or Fast API or Jupyter, or, like there's 1,000 other things that wouldn't fit into that world. And even though you have a ton of experience in that type of programming, you don't ever get a chance to step back and learn because you're just always busy doing that stuff. So the content creation stuff, both on the podcast side and on the course side, it's just a chance to several times a week basically do a research project in something that I didn't know about or I know very little about. Every week. Like imagine if you just did research into something new every week for 5 hours. That's a ridiculous, it's a ridiculous amount of new stuff.
And 5 years, I want to mention for the audience.
Yeah. It has been going on for 5 years now, the podcast, and the course is for 4. So it's really, really powerful. When I told you that I started out in math and I was working on my PhD in math and I liked it. I really enjoyed math. There was some stuff about academics I didn't totally love, but what I really did love was being a teacher. I got to teach all the different levels of calculus and like linear algebra at the university as a graduate student to the undergrads, and I really loved that experience. And when I left, I dropped out of that program and just went into programming. I thought, well, this is something I love that I have to give up, right? But it turns out that you can do that in programming as well, right? And that's kind of this content creation side is you can go and learn these things and think about, how do you communicate that to people? And when you're doing stuff over the internet, you don't, especially over podcasting, you don't get to see people's face when they make that connection. But I hear all the time over email and over Twitter and stuff about, how it's made a difference one way or another. People send me messages like, I got my first programming job because I listened to your podcast and it helped me in this way. And it's just so rewarding. So that joy of like studying and learning stuff and then teaching it back to people, it's still there. It's great.
And I think that was a reason for you to start the podcast as well, to create a new perspective that you felt was lacking. And everyone learns through new perspectives. We all need more perspectives, especially in the world of tech. How did you start with this content creation? You mentioned you were already a teacher. Were you always cognizant of facts of how you can improve as a teacher in general?
I think doing some form of in-person teaching really is valuable if you get a chance. And this could just be giving a presentation at a user group or doing a conference talk. It doesn't have to be something formal like a university thing. But when you have an idea that you understand really well and you try to communicate it to people and you see their face, either, yeah, that works, or nope, that still is not, we still don't understand, Michael. Like that experience, having that a few times really helps sort of figure out what the right way to present stuff is. So one of the things that was really valuable for me is for, I would say 7 years, I was just a straight software developer building applications, really cool stuff. We worked with eye tracking, like what you see on the screen, like all sorts of analysis and automation of that and some other things as well. And that was super fun. But then for quite a while, for like 10 years or so, I did in-person training for software developers. So I would travel around, remember this when you could go outside your home and be around other people?
What?
It's so weird.
What are you talking about?
I saw that once in the movies. No, I'd go around and I'd go spend a week with some company. And it's a little bit like the content creation you're talking about. Like it's definitely not content creation in that regard. But if you go and spend a week with the team that builds printers at Hewlett Packard, and then you go spend a week with people that build, jets that fly around, and then a week with stockbrokers, like your month has had a really different set of experiences than somebody who just went to the same job and did the same work. So it was really valuable. And doing that teaching sort of both taught me how to do the research you got to do and finding ways to present it, right? Because not everything that you're expected to present do you always know, right? Like, okay, well, by next month, I better have this figured out so I can talk about it.
Yeah. Also for the audience, I'd like to mention eye tracking is almost built into every Python framework today, but I think you were working on this in the early 2000s, which was a challenge.
Yeah. This was like 1998 and on. Yeah, this was early days. It was so interesting, the stuff that people did. Yeah, so I could go on and on about it, but it's just super cool. You know, obviously, like you think eye tracking, where do you look on the screen? Like I'm looking at that, then I look at that. And we studied all kinds of different things through there. But the other thing that people are not super aware of with the right hardware is you can study the pupil diameter over time. And it turns out as your brain is thinking, that does like interesting and weird stuff. And so we were able to figure out like some software that would actually determine if you're thinking hard on a problem or not. It was like a CPU meter for the human brain. It was really weird. Obviously, you have no idea what they're thinking about, but you know that they're thinking. And so there's like all these interesting implications. Like if you've got a bunch of air traffic control people and you know these three are thinking really hard, don't give them the new plane. Give the plane to the person whose brain is actually not solving a problem right now. It's just like really interesting stuff we study. But yeah, that was the early days on that technology.
Even I think I recently saw research for self-driving cars where it's better for the system to take over if they notice that the driver is in a deep thought or in a train of thoughts, and that's analyzed through their eyes. So it's still in active development even today.
Yeah. Can you believe we have self-driving cars? I mean, this is like Star Trek to me.
All are being run by Python for the most part.
Yeah. For a large portion, at least the prototype stuff. Huge portion of that is done with Python. And to me, I always felt like AI and that kind of stuff, it was always 30 years down the road. It was like artificial intelligence and nuclear fusion. They were amazing and we kind of understood it, but they were way down. And then all of a sudden, you know, it went from, could we have a chat bot that could solve the Turing test to get in, the car will pick you up and then bring you to me. Like that's just, it's so incredibly different than where it seemed like it was sort of stalling out in the last 10 years. It's just amazing.
And all of that is happening as more people, or as programming gets democratized, generally speaking, or as tech gets democratized. I'm sure you get this question a lot. How would you suggest someone to start in Python today? I'd also drop a plug because I know you might miss it. The Talk Python courses are amazing. I've taken them. I would recommend them, but what would you recommend? How would you suggest someone to start?
Well, thank you for throwing it out there. How would you get started? I think Python is so interesting. It's like other languages are like this, but Python is more like this. I saw this t-shirt that was kind of a funny joke on the idea. It said, I learned Python. It was a great weekend. You know what I mean? Because it's like the language and the way you run stuff, it's not like headers and linkers and libs and like all this craziness. It's just like really, really simple in the language level. But here's the thing. I've been studying the heck out of it for a long time. Every day I still learn more Python. You know, so what is that gap, right? From the person that says, I learned it this weekend to 5 years doing nothing but trying to learn it, still learning it. I think I'm okay at learning. So I don't think that's a problem. I think what it is when you say Python, people mean different things, right? It could be Python, the language, like how do I make a function? How do I do a loop? How do I create a string? It could be Python, the standard library, like all the stuff built into it, right? Like the regular expression stuff and the data structures and the iter tools and just all of that. Or it could be, if you wanted to explode, it could be the 200,000 plus packages, right? Like where SQL Alchemy or Django or Jupyter or TensorFlow are just one of those 220,000 things, right? Then all of a sudden, like you just can't learn it as fast as stuff comes into the library. And so to really deeply learn it, you've kind of got to learn it at all the different levels. So back to your original question, how do you kind of get started? It's best, I think, to learn it in that third form, like learn all the pieces of it, but it's at that same time very overwhelming. So I would recommend that you come up with a problem that you want to solve, and then you just learn enough of the pieces to answer those questions. Like if it doesn't have to do with the web, don't learn Django or any of that stuff. Put that aside. That's another project. You know, maybe it opens CSV files and you want to like graph them in Jupyter. So maybe you got to learn Jupyter, Pandas, and Altair or something like that, right? And just focus on that little narrow thing. And my philosophy about learning things, especially the way I see professionals doing it, is you don't try to learn all of the syntax of the language and then all of the standard library and then maybe something else, right? You say, what do I need to do? Okay, I need to know loops and classes and functions. Okay, just learn that. And then I need these two things from the standard library and I need that one external library. Just zero in on that thing, solve your problem with it, and then go through that process again, and you'll sort of spread out and spread out and spread out. There's a book that I found, ran across. I haven't read it, but it sounds really interesting. Let me share it with you. I just got to real quickly pull up the name.
Sure.
It's called Tiny Python Projects.
Interesting.
So yeah, that's it. It's from Manning. And so the idea is there's like 20 or 30 little projects that you can build in there. And it takes you through all these different little ones, right? So like, how do you build tic-tac-toe, or how do you build, a whole bunch of little random projects. So I think this is this idea of building little things makes a lot of sense. Like in my world, I built the Python Jumpstart by building 10 apps with the same idea. Like, let's build something simple, something a little more complicated, a little more, and you kind of go through that experience of building something from scratch over and over. I don't know about how you feel about it, but one of the challenges, I think, especially early days, is to look at a blank editor and know what to do. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's like the equivalent it's like writer's block, but for programming.
Even for podcast, I think you might agree on this. I just crossed the 100th episode mile, and I think what's helpful for even coming up with the questions is just to have a draft in place from the previous interviews, and you can just iterate on top of that so that you don't go through the block again.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. Yeah, congratulations on 100. That's like 2 years if you're doing it weekly, and it is. I've talked to a lot of people. Side note here, in Portland, we had this remember we could go out and see people. When that was possible, I did that. And we had this really cool unconference for podcasters. And just in Portland, we had 70 different podcasters attend, and I'm like, wow, this is so cool. But what I learned after going year after year is like, there's only a few people I saw the next year who I recognized from the year before. It's easy to get inspired. It's really tricky to keep going. So yeah, awesome. Congratulations on that.
I'm inspired by people like you who have been doing it for much longer and a much better fashion than me.
Let me share something that I don't ever share with the guests because it wouldn't come across good. Sometimes you're just exhausted. It's been like a crazy day. Maybe the dog tore up the couch and you're just like, I can't, I've got to go have this conversation. And I'm really tired. This thing is really frustrating. It would just be nice to not do that right now and just take a break and watch TV. And almost every time that I've had that thought, I've had such an amazing and inspiring experience with the person that I spoke to, not because of me, but because of them. Right. And I'm just like so thankful. So every time I start to think, I could take a break, or I could do I just get re-inspired by all the people doing amazing stuff that I get to talk to.
You wouldn't believe it. People may not believe it, but I 100% agree. Today in the morning, Google services were down. I was freaking the heck out. How do I send the Zoom link to Michael? I've forgotten that again. Even after doing this 100 times, I need to make sure of the questions are in place.
Yeah. And that's how it goes. You're just like, life gets crazy, but then these experiences are so cool because often when we're doing technology and it's not in this format, it's kind of sterilized, right? It's just down to here are the functions, here are the parameters, here's how you use it, here's an example. It's not, oh my gosh, it was so amazing. Here's what I tried, it didn't work. And then we did this thing. And then, I learned from this other place. And it's like we tried to build rockets and that inspired us to add this thing because it didn't work. And just understanding the technology you work with from the human side is so powerful, I think.
Totally.
Yeah.
Coming back to the original question, I also want to really mention your course because people like me who are non-creative computer science students can't come up with good project ideas, and it's a really good start for us because they are already there.
Yeah, thanks. What I really don't like about teaching or learning from either perspective, if I'm trying to teach it or if I was a student in that experience, is I don't like this bottom to top. I have to understand everything. I'm going to give you all the little details, if I'm going to teach you programming, do I have to teach you first calculus and then assembly language and then like all the ideas of algorithms, and or could I just teach you like these 10 lines of code that'll do something amazing with some packages, right? Like, can you look at it from solving the problem top down, or like, do you have to like build and build and build? And so often what that more traditional, more academic style leads to is like, let's talk about loops. This week, we're going to talk about loops. Next week, we talk about functions. The next week, we talk about dictionaries. And nobody goes into programming and says, I want to learn about dictionaries. This is so exciting to me. Nobody. What they want is they want an amazing program that does something cool. And so with that course, with those apps, it was like, what I know you got to cover all those things. What like small and then a little bigger and then a little bigger apps can you build that like bring in one new idea each time without saying the thing we're bringing in is now loops or whatever, you know, it's like, let's just solve something interesting. I think it also solves that blank screen problem, because if you do it like 10 different times, well, the first time you do it for yourself, it's the 11th time. And so then all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, it's kind of like that one. Let's take that as inspiration and go with it.
The draft gets vested in your brain in a sense.
Yeah, in a sense, it absolutely does. That's right. And for podcasting, I have a template that is like always the same, and I copy it, and then I start from there because writer's block.
It's I experience it all the time, so I cannot disagree there. But like you said, top-down learning, and there's this course in deep learning called Fast AI. I'm a big fan of it. We really need more top-down teaching approaches, more ways to get into depth of things. I know you've interviewed the authors of Fluent Python and Effective Python Tricks. How do we get better at Python once you get a hang of it? Because like you said, it's a weekend job, right? Now I know what loops are. Now I know what classes are. But then you get into Python and you really realize that, hey, it's gonna take a while.
I think it has to be keep trying new projects that are a little bit different and just keep experimenting. Like maybe you're really excited about doing home automation. So there's a cool project called Home Assistant, which is written in Python, which is all like basically is the command central for all the home automation things. So you could go like learn with that, or maybe you want to create an API for this thing you've always wanted. So you could go learn Fast API and build that thing. And I think it's just, you just got to keep trying these little ideas and just keep building on them. So I think also if you're already programming as a professional developer, it's still easy to get stuck into like, you're the person that does the database access part and that's it. You know, and you just get stuck with one little part. So in that part, in that aspect, I think what you can do is you can try to do things, try to volunteer yourself for things that would make you stretch your knowledge. Like maybe you've never done any of the web side programming. So volunteer to work on the API stuff with somebody else who has, or nobody knows how to do the e-commerce part. So say, hey, I want to do the e-commerce part, you know, and I'll figure that out. Or we don't have any form of DevOps continuous deployment and we always have this downtime. How could I, maybe learn Ansible and use Python to like solve that problem? And I have no experience, but I know we need it and no one else is doing it. So if you just try to do these things that are a little uncomfortable, that always help you kind of move down the path, that can be super valuable. And you don't have to do anything dramatic to do that, right? Just volunteers the next, sprint meeting or project planning, just say, hey, we have this problem. I would love to solve it. Pick me.
Absolutely. I think what you're referring to is just top-down learning. And in my opinion, it's really hard to overestimate how much helpful top-down learning can be.
Yeah, I think, and it's so much more inspiring to see stuff working. Like I just saw this, somebody sent me this video of this guy, I believe his name was Jeremy Fielding, and he built a table saw, like one of these huge saws that's in the table and you can adjust it. He had one that was not smart at all. It had no machines that you could just turn some wheels and then turn on the saw. And he put in motors that would control the saw and the little parts and how much it goes up and down and the angles. And then he put a Raspberry Pi in there and he built a GUI that had like all sorts of stuff to control the Raspberry Pi, which controlled the sensors for the motor. And what he said blew me away. It was like so excited to just like see the little arm move when he like pushed a button and whatever, you know. But what blew me away is he's like, wow, okay, this is my first Python program, but it looks like it's working. I'm just like, that's your first program. That's that is insane that you're doing this, right? But I just think there's like all these opportunities. I'm not suggesting people build like robot saws, like, but there's just, you know, all these little opportunities for things that you're like, what if I could do this? And it could be like, we just have this really boring Excel thing we have to do, and I don't want to do it by hand anymore. Could I make code that does that, all the way to I build robot things now?
Another great way for the audience I'd like to mention is your podcast. You'll get to hear about using Python in journalism, oil rigs, F1 cars. There's so many things. I am sure I'm going to miss everything, but I hope you listen to this episode before going over to that one. But make sure you listen to the podcast.
But that's one of the things I try to shine a light on. Is it's easy to go out and say, let's interview the people behind Flask because they're amazing, or let's interview the people behind SQL Alchemy because they're amazing. And I've done that; they are amazing. But there's just so many cool stories of people who don't even think of themselves as programmers, but they've learned enough to do something that is genuinely amazing, right? And it's just so cool to see how like within a year or within 6 months, they took on this idea, and then, you know, here's something that everyone's impressed with the output, and it doesn't take that much programming skills. You know, there's so many people that are excited about something that's not programming, but programming would make them so much better at it, you know? And Python is special in that it's a really good choice for that situation as well.
So I'd love to talk more about the podcast. I know it started out of your own frustration of not being able to find a show along these lines. And I read that you were always interested in podcasting, even before it was called that.
That's right. I had this big hard drive. It was a spinning disc type of like MP3 player thing.
What are you talking about?
I know it was before iPods. It was called, I think, a Rio, and man, it was super cool, this thing actually, but it was very old school. And so I would download MP3 files off the internet and stick them on there about, you know, tech conversations and stuff. So before they were even like, there was iTunes and like automated systems and podcast apps, I used to listen to them. And I've always loved listening and learning in this form. Like when I was in college, my favorite math class was the one that was told from like a historical perspective with all the weird twists of history mixed in with the ideas of what you're learning, not just the sterile stuff. And like I already pointed that out. So I think podcasts are pretty special in that regard. And also I think podcasts are very special in that they fit into your life in a place where you're not really occupied, but you can't do other things. Like you're driving, you're cooking and doing the dishes, you're mowing the lawn, you're painting the house. Like you can't watch a video or other things. You know, maybe an audio book works, but that's probably like too focused, right? But these podcasts, they just come along and fit. There's a really interesting idea that I've heard from several people, and I'd like to see if you've heard it from your listeners. And when I first started my podcast, I thought, all right, well, who am I going to be speaking to? Like you just talk to a microphone. It feels like no one's there, but there's people listening, right? So who are these people? I thought they're going to be super experts. Like they're going to know more than me about Python. They're the ones that like just can't get enough from even doing it all day and, you know, working on the libraries. Like they want to hear more about it. So it's going to be the really hardcore developers and the experts and whatnot. And that's true. And there's plenty of those. But I also heard a bunch of people say things like, I'm starting to understand most of what you say. At first, I couldn't understand it all, but now it's starting to make some sense. I'm like, well, why do you listen to this show? This is really weird. Like, I would listen to something that I don't make any sense out of, right? People use it as language immersion. It's kind of like, I want to learn Portuguese, so I moved to Brazil. I didn't know much of Portuguese, but like by the end of the year, I will. And there's a lot of people who are getting into programming who just want to swim in that water, right? They're like, I'm not actually at work in programming. I'm studying it. I want to get there. So, but all the people in this space that you talk to and the ideas, that's the water I want to swim in. So let me just go be there. And right, this like language immersion idea is really interesting.
Absolutely. I have had the same experience. This podcast is more about talking about, I like to call it my hero's journey into the field, and that has been my goal, to just share their journey and make sure it reaches out to people. And I've heard the exact same things from the audience.
Yeah, it's amazing. And going back to your question about how do you learn programming, I think one of the things you can do is just listen to podcasts.
Absolutely. I also want to touch upon a fact that I've noted. You were always, or let me rephrase it. I've learned a lot as I progressed through the podcast of how to be a better speaker. In my opinion, even your first episode with the classic developer
Oh
song
my gosh.
to the episode that was just published this week, I haven't seen a difference in your skill set as a speaker. How did you critique yourself? How did you improve your skills as a podcaster?
Well, thank you, I guess. Either I've started out good and then stayed good, or it's not improved, but no, it's I see what you're saying. Thank you. I think partly one of the changes that nobody would see is I think there was more editing in the beginning, right? So there would be more like uncertainty, or there'd be right, but we would take that out. We wouldn't publish that. So I think in some degrees it probably has gotten better, and people just don't know. Certainly I've gotten more efficient at like trying to research projects and talk to people about it, because it could be a lot of work. But I think it goes back to the public speaking stuff, to being a teacher at college, to doing presentations at all the different companies I was doing training at. So after enough years of that, it's kind of sort of stuck, and it sort of is in there. So I would say that's how it goes. Like, how's your experience been? You grow over time, right? It's like 100 different conversations that are supposed to be structured. It's a lot.
Absolutely. I feel like the idiot who's asking stupid questions to really smart people. And over time, I've gotten better. I know what you're talking about, editing out the parts of conversation. And I almost, if you're not cringing on your episode from 50 days ago, you're not improving as a podcaster.
Exactly. It's like all the editing stuff. And you're just like, why do I say this? Why do I do this? I have to take this out, and then eventually you just stop doing it. But I think things like this, they really open up the doors for you. And people out there listening who are like, how do I get better in my career? How do I get started? Like things like public speaking, almost no developer wants to do that. Right. They're always like, oh no, I don't like, I'm not a people person. I'm not hired doing these things. So if you can develop the skills like podcasting like you are, or speaking at a meetup, or speaking at a conference, that puts you in a very rare group, and it gives you a lot of visibility for your career going forward. So it's a huge skill to develop, either as a podcaster or much more generally.
Completely agree with you. Going back to your journey with the podcast, what conversations have you enjoyed the most? You've been doing this for 5 years. What have you learned outside of the general idea, which is you improve, and you're a programmer, so you'd already, of course, automate the process. You'd learn how to better host the podcast. Outside of that, what would you say were your main learnings?
Well, the podcast, I built all the infrastructure for it. One, because when I started, there was not a lot of great infrastructure. But it gave me a chance to play with a bunch of ideas, and running stuff in deployment and running on Linux machines. And now with the courses, I've got a bunch more of that. So it's a cool thing to just keep building on in one regard. On the other, I'm just always surprised at how many people are doing interesting stuff with just a little bit of programming skill. Like I always thought of like, you have to be an expert to be a programmer. And there's just so many people who they've just done so much amazing stuff by learning just a little bit, right? Like, oh, I'm an astronomer, but I'm going to actually learn, image recognition. So one of the people that I'm having on Talk Python shortly is this two guys out of the UK who were the first to discover a bunch of exoplanets using artificial intelligence in Python and TensorFlow, right? They're like, oh, it's really Yeah, it's really cumbersome to just like go through all these like graphs and stuff and try to figure out it from the satellite data. So why didn't we just teach a machine and they turned it on the Kepler data and it came up with 50 new exoplanets in like a day? If you can discover 50 new planets in a day, you've done something really special, right?
Absolutely.
And it's not like that much programming, I don't think. It's just really clever applications of TensorFlow and some other things along those lines.
Why it's really important, as we were talking earlier, to democratize these things, to increase diversity, because we need more people from the outside to look at things from new perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just see these stories over and over and over, and every time I'm just like, wow, really? I had no idea you could do that, right? Just these different areas which it's applied to, and it makes me smile every time to see what people are doing. Right, I got to talk to the people at the Large Hadron Collider several times about what they're using. They're actually doing machine learning to visualize, to understand, look at the image data coming out of the collisions and try to automatically detect things like the Higgs boson and other stuff, other quarks or quarks they don't even know about, using Python and things like this. It's just like, wow.
I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised anymore by how much you keep getting surprised by all this.
Yeah, you kind of get used to being surprised, but never do I cease to be just like, really happy and excited about it, because it's always something different, and it's always just really neat to see what people are doing. Like people's creativity, it doesn't stop.
I'm sure. Would also like to give a shout out to your other podcast, Python Bytes. It's one of the best ways to keep up with what's going on in the community. Can you give us an insight to what's happening behind the scenes? There's a lot of research that happens, I'm sure, and the audience doesn't need to know how much effort goes into it. I'm sure it's a lot. What's happening behind the scenes? How do you prepare for it, and how do you distill what you want to talk about? Because I'm sure there's a lot more that could be covered.
Oh yeah, there's tons that can be covered. First of all, the reason I have two podcasts is I have strong opinions on what they should be. Like a lot of shows you'll have, well, here's the 10 minutes where we talk about the news and what's interesting this week. And then here's some like conversation that has no expiration date, right?
Yeah.
And why those two things are together, I just don't know. Like, why would you have something that lasts for years with something that's only valid for a couple of weeks in the same mix? And so I'm like, well, I don't want to do that to my show, because I have all these timely things like learning about how they're using machine learning to figure out do further research into the Higgs boson. Like that doesn't need to be mixed in with, this week they released Python 3.7, so be sure to give it a try, right? So I wanted to create something totally separate that was just for those people who just want to keep up to date. Not everyone wants to listen to an hour-long interview, right? I mean, a lot of people do, but a lot of times people want to just balance in and out. So I'm like, all right, well, let me create this other format that is really short and quick, where people can just come in and spend 5 minutes and get something really cool out of it. And what I think is great is there's just so many different little libraries and tools. Like every week, you probably, no matter how much experience you have, there's probably something that you didn't know about that then you could use at work or something along those lines. And yeah, it's really fun to do that research. I used to look all over the place. I used to look, just do tons of research and pull things in. And now a lot of people send me suggestions. So it's really about trying to pick what I think is interesting and then go do the research on that and just dive into it quick and, try to pull out what's interesting. I'm getting better at that. We've had a lot of practice. We've done that for about 4 years now. So every week, 4 years, you try to go quickly learn and see what's interesting. You get pretty good at it.
As one of the best persons who's doing this, you keep getting better. So that's really amazing for us as your audience. And that's also a recurring theme on this podcast. Even though I mostly interview my machine learning heroes, anyone who's had experience in the field, they like to innovate. They like to keep checking out new things. So that to some extent has its own importance, even generally in programming.
Yeah. I agree. I think, that's both the blessing and curse of being in programming, that you have to keep learning, right? So if you thrive on that and you love it, it's like you're never going to get bored because there's always something new to keep building on and growing. But if you're not really that kind of person. I got my degree. Now I just want to do the programming. I just keep doing, like, I don't want to read stuff or keep doing research. I feel like I'm done. I've got my degree. I've earned, like, that doesn't work for programming, right?
Absolutely.
Not well anyway. But if you like that stuff, man, it's like you can just thrive so much on it because it's just constant. So exciting.
The other thing that you mentioned, which is, I like to call it the legacy of the content. People will discover podcasts. Many people don't realize this, that whatever you put on the internet, blog posts, podcast, will be discovered later as well. And then the person will go, hey, what is Python 3.7? Aren't we using Python 10 today?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I don't really think about it that often, but it is super weird to think that somebody's going to come and find it. I mean, I do have people who go back and listen to stuff I did 5 years ago, and some of it's completely out of date and some of it's 100% relevant. But it's even weirder to think, historians might look back at podcasts in 100 years and go, what was happening? Well, let's listen to this podcast. And who knows, like, how valuable or important or even informed that podcaster was, or the guest, but it's, the internet is written in ink.
Yeah.
It's permanent. Yeah.
In Pythonic ink.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Another topic that I want to touch upon is creating a business around content. You also need to support yourself. People sometimes forget that. How did you go about it? And I think I'd like to really point out one fact that people don't notice. They don't need to, but you still do it. You mentioned in a small font that ads are being served ethically. And this show is carbon neutral. Can you also share your foundational pillars for creating the business around it?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you for noticing those things. So I'll touch on the quick and easy ones first. The carbon neutral thing. A year and a half ago, I decided I'm going to make an explicit effort to either use some form of renewable energy or to offset the energy that we might use that goes to, like, if you do hosting or whatever, like, you might not be able to control all that, especially don't control the stuff that goes through the pipes. But, you can do things like plant 10,000 trees or, buy a bunch of carbon credits to be redistributed into the grid instead of coal, right? And it's, to be honest, for us, it's not a huge amount of money to do that for what we're doing for the courses and for the podcast and so on. But what I hoped is that it would be a message. So what I hope is that people will look at that and they go, oh, our company makes $1 billion a year. We're not carbon neutral. How can this guy be carbon neutral, right? So just hopefully, I don't think it's a big impact for me personally. Hopefully it inspires some other people to bring up these conversations where it will make a big impact, right? I'm very passionate about trying to get ahead of the whole climate change thing. It just blows my mind that people are not excited about renewable technologies. It's just, there's so many amazing things that we could do with, solar, with wind, with who knows what, that we haven't even created. It seems like there's just a lot of history and a lot of old ways of doing things stuck in the way. But I feel like people should be excited about the opportunities and be taking more advantage of it. So anyway, long answer to that. That's why I put that up there. It is carbon neutral, but the big impact hopefully is inspiring other companies and other people to do that. Ads served ethically also are such a pet peeve of mine. I'll have an ad blocker on my browser, not because I actually hate ads that much, but because they're sold through these third-party channels. Sometimes people put viruses in them. They're just, right? They take over your page. They make it take a second longer to load because the JavaScript is running who knows what. And I want to support the people, but I don't want to encourage that type of thing. And it blows my mind that I go to places and they have no way to sell ads without tracking and without relying on these unknown, untrusted third parties. Now, if there's some guy running a blog and he has AdWords, I totally get it. That's what he's doing. If you are CNN or the New York Times or CNET or something like that, there's no way they cannot talk to their advertisers and say, let us serve the ad directly to you. If that was just an image and a link on their server, they wouldn't need to show me, please disable your ad blocker, because the ad blocker wouldn't even know it's an ad. It wouldn't care. And there's no reason to disable it. It's because it's these sneaky, like super, like reselling your data. Like, oh, I saw you on this site and that site, so you must be this type of person stuff that I think is, very negative to the entire industry. And the thing is, like, if I can support my whole business selling ads by directly working with the people buying and selling ads, surely the New York Times and CNET can talk to their advertisers, right? Like, I'm small compared to them, and those advertisers would love to be there. So I just don't see that it is necessary to, do retargeting and tracking, and especially running these creepy third-party things with like browser fingerprinting and stuff like that.
And I also want to mention that someone who has an audience of your size or a scale of your size, you're tempted to, I'm sure you get a lot of people reaching out to you. You're almost tempted to completely advertise it, somewhat oversell things. How do you decide which advertisers to bring on? What goes on behind the scenes there? I'm sure a lot of things happen that the audience doesn't get to see.
Yeah, well, the main thing that the rule that I use is, if my listeners hear this ad, will they go, oh, that's cool, I didn't know about that? Or will they go, oh, not again, what is this thing, right? And so I've had mattress companies try to sponsor the show, and I'm like, nope, we're not selling mattresses on the show. I know we got to sleep, but it's not about sleeping. We're not doing it. I had a credit card company come on and say, hey, we want to sponsor your show. And I'm like, I'm not letting you like sell credit cards on my podcast. They're like, no, we're doing machine learning, and we're hiring a job. We're looking for like someone doing data science, and we want to hire them. So we're going to run an ad for a job. Like, oh, okay, then you can sponsor the show, right? Like that's the rule. Like, I think some listeners would like to hear about like a cool ad or an ad for a cool job doing cutting edge Python. They don't want to hear about like a credit card offer or a mattress or so on. So I just, I try to have that balance. And I guess it's probably lucky that I can say no to people, but also like, people listen. I didn't have ads in the beginning. Obviously, like, you start from zero and go up. The first time I ran some ads, like, some people were like, oh, I'm going to hate this. Like, I can't believe it. You just sold out. And then, 6 months later, I got a message like, yeah, sorry I said that. It seems like it's fine. I don't really mind them, because they're not like creepy or weird or whatever. And I try to keep it short and so on. So it's also tricky to have a separation between content and ads, right? Because a lot of companies are like, hey, we would love to have our person come on and do like an hour-long presentation about our thing. You're like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. It's very clear. This part's the ad. And if you have something interesting, you may be able to come on the show and talk about it, but it's not because you're going to pay for it, right?
And just wanted to point out that these are things that the listeners don't need to know, but these do happen behind the scenes. A lot of thoughts do go in there as well that we don't get to see.
Yeah. Also, you were just talking about like starting the whole business around like the podcast and stuff. And so people who don't necessarily know, like, my income is 100% the podcast and the courses. And for the courses, we share that revenue with the authors, and there's some expenses for other people working for us and whatnot. But it's all around that basic idea. What I've learned very painfully is the hardest part of building a technology company is to get the word out, is the marketing and the awareness, right? Like, I've created a bunch of other ideas that I thought were awesome, and I know they were awesome. Other people said, this is really cool, but nobody came. Like, not nobody. Some people came, but not enough to like even come close to paying the bills. And so when I thought about the podcast and stuff, I'm like, I did start it because I was just interested, but I'm like, all right, well, if I take this out a little farther, what would I do? It's like, okay, well, I could build up the podcast, and then eventually, if I got to a point where it was successful enough, I could quit my job and start doing courses and maybe have some other people do courses with me. And the reason I was confident that would work is it all depended upon having enough people interested in what I was doing and what I had to say. That's the hardest part, right? I knew I could make courses. What I was not at all clear about is like, would anybody be aware of them and would they come and know, right? So yeah, actually, when I launched the course side of my business, I launched it on Kickstarter. And it was
Okay,
very nerve-wracking, but it was very cool. This is back when Kickstarter was all the hotness. And I was super nervous because I had to quit my job 100%. It was a education, developer education company. I couldn't do both. So you got to quit to start the other one, or it's like, well, you're doing this side job that is your job and that's not legal and stuff. So it was very nerve-wracking. I have kids and a mortgage and all that. But then I put the stuff on Kickstarter a few days later and it funded in like 12 hours. I'm like, oh, this is going to be okay. But the whole magic, the reason that worked is there was already people who were interested in it and I could talk to them about it and they trusted me. And I, think I've mostly, earned that trust and kept it up and whatnot. But it's so awesome as software developers that we have like basically this magic power, right? We're literally magicians. Like, what does a magician do? A magician thinks of like a spell or like a thing they want, and then they do stuff with a wand or something, and then that exists. Like, we don't have wands, we have keyboards, but we think of something and we click around on it for a bit and then it exists, right? That's so special and amazing. It's very different than even like a world-class architect has to come up with money to pay for the building and stuff, right? We just think of it and it exists. But the flip side is it's still really hard to get the word out about that. So that's the two pieces that have to go together to make it work.
I think as programmers or as tech people in general, we don't talk a lot, and if we talk a lot, we get worried. Am I oversharing? Am I over marketing this? So that's also tricky. And in the opposite world, things are being thrown out so much that people might miss it, and it's also a necessity. So you need to strike that balance.
Yeah, you absolutely do. And I think, I don't know about you, but for me, like marketing and like sales was just like really like I guess that's required and necessary, but marketing and sales seems like shady and like just something I don't want anything to do with. And for a lot of ways in which it's done, I think that's true. But like if you build something amazing, you've got to be able to tell people about it, right? Like Netflix wouldn't be doing what it's doing if they couldn't have somehow communicated to people. Like what Netflix is doing is pretty awesome, but they had to tell people or Netflix wouldn't exist. And there's like, that story repeated 1,000 times or more.
I have to agree with you. Sometimes I feel maybe I should make sure that more people listen to the episodes. Then the second thought after that is maybe the show doesn't deserve it. Maybe I'm not doing a good job. And then every day I get to hear, hey, I wish I had found this episode earlier.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, you've got to tell people about it. There's, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of podcasts, but there's a whole bunch. But yeah, yours is good, so you should tell people about it.
Thank you. Would also love to highlight the courses you're teaching or you have up on the website right now. And are you also conducting trainings outside of that? I'm sorry, I should have checked that.
Yeah, no. Currently, my philosophy is to try to just keep building the online stuff. I feel like I can help the most people there. Like I said, I really enjoyed, say, teaching like calculus. Like I taught, calculus at Purdue for a year, and I loved working with the people there. It was so much fun. I got to interact with like 60 students over a whole year, taking a whole year's worth of work, and I probably helped them. But, doing stuff online and at scale is just, you could help thousands of people instead of tens of people. It's just, so my focus is try to be on that realm. And so I'm not doing anything other than the online stuff right now.
Okay. Got it. Would also like to highlight that before this, I think it was completely on Talk Python's website. Now there's also a project with Manning who connected us. Mm-hmm. Can you highlight that as well?
Yeah, sure. So Manning has an online video platform called Manning Live Video. I think Manning is great. They've got some of the best books and so on. And like I said, that like that Tiny Python Practices or Exercises book, that was from Manning. So they do really good stuff. And they reached out and said, hey, you have a really cool library of Python courses. Could we take a select set that we think would fit with our audience and publish them as like a Talk Python series on Manning Live Video? So if you happen to be a Manning customer or you want to be, you can go over there and you can watch 5 of our courses over there. We've got like the async course. We've got one of my favorite ones is a Flask course where we rebuild pypi.org. the place where we learn about Python packages, we rebuild that from scratch in Flask. And that's what the course is. Like, again, not just telling you about how Flask works, but like, how do we like make a project that we get to build something cool? Like, there's a website that everybody knows. Let's go build that and see what that experience would be like, right? So there's a bunch of courses like that. We have the one on async programming. Everyone talks about how hard async is. I don't know why. It's not that hard. It's just mysterious. And so we need someone to shine a light on like, this is the blueprint. This is the path you follow. Then it's pretty awesome. So yeah, there's 5 cool courses up there on Manning as well.
Okay, I think there'd be a giveaway of some format. It'll be there in the intro, which I think I'll record after this.
Yeah, beautiful.
I think, and this is a final question in general that I usually like to ask. Let's say someone listens to this episode and emails you, "Hey, Michael, I heard your podcast with some random dude. How do I get started in Python? I really enjoyed. I'm motivated by that. Please help me chart if you may, a career path or a trajectory into Python or programming for them."
I think you need to see what you're inspired by. Like, Python has basically 3 branches. It has the web API, web developer, web application side, and it's got the data science side. And then it's got all these little interesting but random projects. So you kind of got to pick a path, right? Do you go down the data science side? Do you go down the web and API side? Or are you doing something else? Once you pick that, I think you first need to learn the language. And then you need to start solving these projects, right? Figure out the projects you want to work on and what external libraries there are to do that. The best place to find the external libraries, as far as I know, is Awesome Python. I think it's the awesome-python.com. I think it's a .com. And the idea there is like, you can go, there's a catalog of topics and say, I want to learn about image processing. So then here's the top 10 libraries for image processing. Because one of the big challenges for new folks learning Python or learning anything that's in the regard, like the type of situation, this should be JavaScript as well, or C# or a lot of languages that have huge open source libraries to be selected from, is that's amazing. But as a beginner, when you say there's 200,000 choices, that doesn't feel good. That feels overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
You're like, how am I ever going to learn this, right? You don't need to learn all 200,000. You need to figure out the 1 or 2 that is really common and interesting and useful, and the ones you need. And so that Awesome Python place is a good place to help you select just the few things to pay attention to. Then it goes down from some huge thing you got to learn to very focused, and it seems much more doable. There's some good books out there people can take. Online courses, like I honestly think that my courses, if you're willing to spend a little bit of money, are pretty good beginner courses. I just wrote one called Python for the Absolute Beginner that is like covers all the stuff you would have missed if you didn't take computer science, but would have been covered in the first year, like data structures and algorithms and problem solving in addition to Python. So, but again, it has like building examples. If you don't want to take one of those courses, you can also do things like on Free Code Camp. They've got some not too bad stuff on YouTube. They do a pretty good job.
Honestly, I also want to mention many people who listen to this know that I don't mind spending any amount on education, and I feel your courses are still underrated.
Thanks.
Still keep subscribing to courses that are aimed at beginners just to get a new perspective, even though it's just a weekend's task somewhat now. That's not to discourage anyone, but still I really enjoyed your courses, even though I subscribed to them just a little while ago.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I am so happy and honored and excited to be able to be doing that as my job, that it's just like I put all my energy into it because it's so much fun and it's so much better than the stuff that I was doing before. Not that it was bad, but it's just like, this is the thing you really want to create, and it's so fun to do it. So anytime people take those courses, it just lets me do more of that, and it just makes me really, really feel lucky and happy. And so thanks for spreading the word too.
It definitely comes across. Before we end the call, what would be the best platforms for the audience to connect with you? I know you're active on Twitter, and talkpython.fm is the website. Any other places?
Really Twitter, if you want to have a quick chat with me, I'm at mkennedy, or listen to the podcast, either Talk Python or Python Bytes. So talkpython.fm or Python Bytes with a Y, as in the data structure, not the act of eating. pythonbytes.fm. And those are the two.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for your time and for creating this podcast, Talk Python, for all of us to learn programming through, and even in general for helping all of us learn programming.
Oh, thank you, Sanyam. It's really great to be on the show, and congratulations on getting past 100. That's a rare milestone. That's excellent. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to give it a review or feel free to shoot me a message. You can find all of the social media links in the description. If you like the show, please subscribe and tune in each week to Chai Time Data Science.